Now we talked about China in the previous video. Um, Japan, the beginning of imperialism in Japan and the subsequent story of Japan's involvement in imperialism is very, very different from China. So not all Asian countries are exactly alike in the story. So what we're going to see eventually in Japan, which we won't talk about today, is that Japan will start to actually become an imperialist country itself. It's going to start to control other countries, particularly China. But when Japan first opens up to the West, um, it's a very interesting to maybe kind of connect that to Japan's future in imperialism. So like China, at first Japan didn't want to have anything to do with any outside country. It had what was called a policy of exclusion in effect for about 200 years. Um, so basically, the reason why Japan opens up to the West is because of these Western countries feeling like Japan should open its ports to foreign trade. All right, they've already opened up to China at this point. They also want to be able to access Japan. And the opening up of Japan was actually initiated by an American. His name was Commodore Matthew Perry. Okay, so again, an American. And in 1853, he forces Japan to open up trade to the West. Okay, and Japan does so. All right, remember how the opening up of China actually took two wars, right, as well as the Taiping Rebellion. All right, 20 million people in China had to die for its doors to formally be open to the West. However, Japan agrees in 1853 to open up its doors to Western trade. Why? Because Japan is afraid of a military or naval reaction if they say no. Maybe they were kind of learning from what at that point was currently going on in China. 1853, it was the middle, it was actually, no, shortly before the Second Opium War. They had just seen the Treaty of Nanking be signed. They'd seen the First Opium War in China. Maybe they were just afraid that the U.S. and maybe other parts of Western Europe might also take military action against Japan if they said no. So you're going to see that there's going to be a series of treaties after 1853 that open the rest of Japan to foreign trade. So foreign merchants are going to start freely entering Japan and trading with them. So the major difference in the beginning of the story between China and Japan is that all it took to open up Japan was the threat of war. All right. In China, it took multiple actual wars to open its doors. All right, and again, in the future, we're going to talk about how Japan actually starts to become an imperial country itself. So maybe one of the reasons why it is so willing to do this is because it does readily open its doors. Maybe it starts to see the benefits to of being an imperializing country. It certainly is much more open to the idea of westernizing and modernizing as a result of the opening up of its doors to foreign trade. So all of these things could play a role in Japan's future in the game of imperialism. All right, Egypt. We're going to talk more about the scramble for Africa for tomorrow's class, but ultimately what you're going to see is that the British occupation of Egypt is going to basically provide a model for a lot of future examples of imperialism. All right, so the story of Egypt prior to this age of imperialism here. I'm just slightly moving this so you can see the whole map. Okay, so prior to this age of imperialism, Egypt had been controlled by foreigners before. All right, most significantly the Ottoman Empire. And you can see this map here is showing us the Ottoman Empire at its height, which is bordered in red. And you see that Egypt had been part of the Ottoman Empire ever since the 16th century. Okay, also during the French Revolution, France briefly occupied Egypt as well. All right, but by the time we get to the age of imperialism, we see that um, Egypt has become a de facto independent state. Technically, Egypt is still part of the Ottoman Empire, but you have a Turkish ruler, a man named Muhammad Ali, who is here, who does a bunch of things to try to modernize Egypt and ultimately make it exist independently from the Ottoman Empire. All right. So under Muhammad Ali, a bunch of reforms are issued to improve the military, the agricultural system, and the communications networks in Egypt. And this modernization of Egypt is actually going to encourage a lot of Europeans to start migrating there and kind of take advantage of its developing economy and maybe even participate in Egypt's military. All right, so this modernization is one of the reasons why there is this European interest in Egypt. All right, another important result of this modernization, though, is that a lot of previous agricultural workers actually do not fare very well from this change. All right, this is kind of like the agricultural revolution in Europe. All right, so basically what you see is there were a bunch of people who used to work as farmers in Egypt that suddenly, with the modernization of agriculture, don't have jobs anymore, right? Because now, you're able to produce much more for a wider amount of people. Not 90% of the population anymore has to be involved in agricultural production. So you're actually going to see that peasants uh, in Egypt at this point are actually going to be forced to produce cash crops for European consumers, because what Europeans really want is access to really cheap raw materials. You're going to start to see certain agricultural workers in Egypt start to work on more plantation-like systems. So again, producing some kind of product in mass quantities for European consumers to buy really cheaply. So basically what you're going to see is that no longer is agriculture going to be self-sufficient in Egypt. You're going to see that it's very much going to be dictated by European demands. All right. So after Muhammad Ali dies, his grandson becomes the prince or the Khedive of Egypt. His name is Ismail. And he also, like his grandfather, is trying to continue to modernize and westernize Egypt. He wants Egypt to be seen as more of a part of Europe than Africa. But he actually is a little bit overzealous in this aspect because he spends way more money than he should trying to modernize Egypt. All right. So you're going to see that because they spend way too much money, they're going to actually have to turn to some countries in Europe for assistance because they start to get in some financial trouble. So largely, they're going to turn to Britain and France to kind of assist them. And what this leads to is that France and Britain are going to start to control most of Egypt's finances. Really significantly, in 1875, in order to try to help out Egypt's economic predicament, it buys a significant portion of shares for the Suez Canal and begins managing it. So the Suez Canal is right up here. The reason why I have this huge map is you see the reason why England would have been so interested in owning or controlling the Suez Canal is because it's a huge shortcut from Britain, which would be here if we had a bigger map, right, all the way to its jewel, which is India, which we're going to talk about in the future. India's over there, we can't see it, but you see how much, of course, this is a time where we're still trading largely by sea, how much more easy it would be for England to reach India if it has control over the Suez Canal. All right, so this is actually going to be significant to Egypt because Britain's occupation of the canal, even if they paid for it, is going to trigger a lot of nationalistic reactions, and there's going to be a bunch of riots that take place against this sort of against this British occupation of the Suez Canal. Because of these nationalistic riots, it's actually going to lead Britain to exert more control, and Britain is actually going to start to occupy all of Egypt as a result of these riots. In 1883, Britain is going to declare Egypt a protectorate. So ultimately, what this is going to do is make it so that Egypt is not technically ruled by England, but Britain is, so to speak, protecting England. What this does is it's going to set the stage for a lot of other examples of European powers starting to exert control over foreign countries, particularly in Africa. It's going to provide a model, so to speak. What this protectorate does, first off, is it's going to exclude the French from Egyptian affairs. So we know earlier that the French were also there to try to assist Egypt financially, but really Britain wants to be the only foreign country involved in Egyptian affairs. So this declaring Egypt a protectorate allows only England to have influence over Egypt, no longer France. Mainly what Britain wants to do is protect the Suez Canal. All right. So what we're going to see is, because they want to protect the Suez Canal, this is really one of the main reasons why England occupies Egypt, and eventually it's also going to initiate a bloody conquest for the Sudan, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So England actually claimed that this protectorate was going to be temporary, but it actually lasts until 1956. So it's not so temporary, as we can see. All right, now this protectorate, again, does not mean that there is actual British rule. All right, it's sort of a de facto rule. Technically, even during this protectorate period, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, but Britain, in reality, controls the country. All right, so what we're going to see is that during this protectorate period, there still was a prince, there still is a Khedive that exists, but it's basically a puppet government. And Britain is going to try to issue some economic reforms to help peasants and please European bondholders in Egypt. So it's going to try to influence Egyptian economic affairs while it's controlling it, ultimately to make sure that, you know, things that are being produced in England, or in Egypt that is, are going to be beneficial to any European people that are living there, that are trading there, and ultimately making it so that Egypt will have favorable trade terms with Egypt as well. So that's kind of scratching the surface, the beginning examples of imperialism with China, Japan, and Egypt. We're going to talk about the rest of Africa next time. Very, very significant, the scramble for Africa. And then we're going to return to Asia after that by looking at how China and Japan react to imperialism. Very, very different stories between those two countries. And then in the last section, we're going to talk about how different people respond to imperialism, right? So ultimately, we're going to see that there are certainly anti-imperialist movements, which are very significant. And we should also be thinking in the back of our heads during this entire chapter how imperialism is one of the major factors towards World War I. So until next time, I will see you.